Hey all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about Breakheart Pass on Blu-ray. Breakheart Pass was a Western that came out in 1975 and it was directed by Tom Gries. And the first time I saw it was when, a while back, I was having dinner with my folks and it was on TV. And so naturally there were a lot of commercials, but it was Charles Bronson in a Western. I was interested. So the first time I saw Charles Bronson in anything was in a film called Hard Times. And it was on a VHS tape my dad had, and I was somewhere between elementary school and junior high. So yeah, I was much younger when I saw Hard Times, first. But it was good though. I mean, Charles Bronson, he made an impression on me, and any movie I saw him in afterwards, it was kind of like my appreciation for him as an actor grew. And for those of you who don't know, Hard Times was also the first film that Walter Hill directed. So if you like films that are set in the Depression, or if you like films with Charles Bronson or films that are directed by Walter Hill, definitely check out Hard Times. So Charles Bronson was someone who went on to rightfully be regarded as one of the most memorable strong silent type of lead actors in cinema, because he was someone who could say a lot through pure physical mannerisms and or expression, and he could say a lot through saying a little, or by only saying a little. And much like, say, real life strong but silent types, when he opened his mouth and had something to say, you tend to remember it. But he had the distinction of appearing in 5 films that have rightfully gone on to be regarded as straight up masterpieces these days. The films being The Magnificent Seven, The Dirty Dozen, Battle of the Bulge, The Great Escape, and last but not least, Once Upon a Time in the West. Once Upon a Time in the West. So all 5 of those films are great movies, and he had prominent roles in all 5 of them. And so he already got a bit of a boost in recognition and fame because of those films. But he was in literally hundreds of films throughout his career. And when he had the lead in a movie, or the lead role in a movie, he was usually the strong silent type of protagonist. But he did unfortunately become a little bit of a subject of parody, starting in the 80s, because going back to the 70s, he was in a film called Death Wish, and it was one of those films that had something to say about urban crime and vigilantism. And so whether you agreed with his character's actions in the film, they went out of their way to give his character a sympathetic backstory, to a point where it's like, even if you don't agree with what he's doing as a vigilante, you understand why he became a vigilante and why he's doing what he's doing. And so the movie was a bit divisive amongst audiences, but it does have a certain level of genuine respect within the realms of cinema. I wouldn't say it's a masterpiece, but it is a good crime drama. And if you want to see like a good vigilante film, or one of the films that sort of defined the vigilante genre, the original Death Wish is something to check out. I wouldn't say it's a masterpiece like the original Dirty Harry, but it's in that territory. But whereas the first Death Wish film was something that had a certain amount of substance attached to it, the sequels, which began in the 80s and went into the 90s, you could not say the same for those. So while the sequels may have been fun in a sort of mindless, over the top way, any sort of depth or nuance that the first one had was absent in the sequels. And so he went from someone who was a flawed, sympathetic character in the first one to, I'm a one-man, army who's going to blow you away and throw a witty one-liner at you. And, oftentimes he would have an excessive amount of firepower, or, even downright explosive firepower. And then he'd throw a witty one-liner. Or sometimes he'd throw a witty one-liner, then blow you away. And I will say the witty one-liners were funny. I'll say that much, but you wouldn't be able to mistake the Death Wish sequels for legitimately good movies, like say the first Death Wish was. But from what I understand, he did have a sense of humor about the whole thing. Like, while he did become a little bit frustrated, because he for a time was kind of pigeonholed into one-man army, vigilante flicks, because people kind of took a cue from the Death Wish sequels and would put him in, other films that may as well be a Death Wish sequel. He did appreciate a good parody. Like if someone did a parody of his Death Wish movies, at the time that he was still alive, and it was actually a well done parody, he tended to get a kick out of it, from what I understand. But in real life, though, Charles Bronson, aside from being a very distinctive tough guy actor, he had a very fascinating story, true story, or true life story. And like anyone else in life, there's no small amount of tragedy, that's a part of the story. But there's also quite a bit of, heartwarming moments that, that I've learned about over the years. Case in point, this is something I learned about fairly recently, but I saw a clip from one of those late night talk shows, and Kurt Russell was the guest. And somehow or another, the two of them got to talking about Charles Bronson. And so when Kurt Russell was a child actor, there was a point where he and Charles Bronson were in something together. And one day he got Charles Bronson, I think it was like a toy airplane or something, for his birthday. And Charles Bronson, he's looking at the toy, and he's looking at Kurt Russell, and then he kind of just goes back into his trailer without saying anything. And of course, Kurt Russell being a little kid, he's, afraid that he's just somehow pissed off Charles Bronson. He's asking around, like, did I just make him angry? And everyone's like, no, that's just Charlie. He doesn't talk much. But then one day, shortly after that, Charles Bronson, took Kurt Russell aside and said, you know what? No one's ever gotten me a birthday present before. And so from then on, he and, Kurt Russell were tight, and were really good friends. And so, I love, hearing stories like that. But until I happened to, stumble upon that little clip there, I had no idea about that. So I already liked Charles Bronson, but, my respect for him as a person just, went up. The fact that, like, he would take a kid under his wing, and and be like a sort of mentor / friend to him. But yeah, Charles Bronson, very fascinating individual. If you get a chance to read about him sometime, do so. There are all sorts of fascinating stories about him. But yeah, let's go ahead and get into the movie. So Breakheart Pass, it kicks off in the 1870s, and there's this express train that makes a pit stop at this whistle stop. It's basically like a rest stop for trains. So the crew can stretch their legs, and they can get rid of passengers, or maybe take on some more passengers, or at least get more supplies. And there's a bunch of soldiers on this train, because it turns out this is like a classified military trip. And so while everyone's taking a break and everything, a bit of action unfolds in this little saloon at this whistle stop. And namely, there's a criminal named John Deakin, played by Charles Bronson, who is recognized by a few people, including one Marshal Pearce, played by Ben Johnson. And Marshal Pearce, takes him in, and turns out that John Deakin is a violent criminal with a $2,000 bounty on his head. And, of course, John Deakin, he's not exactly, overly eager to be arrested, but, he goes, with a minimum of fuss. And Marshal Pearce, he insists that that the train, takes him and Deakin to Fort Humboldt, and because it turns out this train is going to Fort Humboldt, but they're saying that they can't take them because they're on a classified mission, and they kind of go back and forth and argue, and eventually they concede and allow Marshal Pearce to bring John Deakin aboard, and mainly because Marshal Pearce is a figure of federal authority, and so government connections and what have you, and so they're like, okay, all right, but no one else. And so the two of them, are taken onto the train, and before the train disembarks, the leader of the soldiers, one Sergeant Bellow, played by Rayford Barnes, is informed that two of the soldiers are missing, and we're talking like out of, probably like about 40 people, 40 or 50 people. So two soldiers missing out of a group that large, I mean, doesn't scream overwhelming emergency, but it is something that's more than a bit annoying, because these are supposed to be professionals, right? And so they knew what time the train was going to be leaving, and so so Sergeant Bellows says, well, hey, it's their fault if they can't make it to a train on time. And so they go ahead and leave without the soldiers. And, the train, proceeds on its trip, going through the Rocky Mountains. And, yeah, sorry, I had to check something real quick. Yeah, through the Rocky Mountains. And, at first, I mean, very little seems to be, off about this trip. I mean, we get to know some of the characters and their motivations and what have you. And for one, you have the Nevada governor, Richard Fairchild, played by Richard Crenna, and his fiancée, Marica, played by Jill Ireland. And the reason that the two of them are heading to Fort Humboldt is because Marica's father is in command of the army stationed at Fort Humboldt. And, once Marshal Pearce and John Deakin are basically made aware of the situation, they kind of are like, okay, we understand why y'all were reluctant to take us on, because it turns out, that this train, is on, a mission of mercy, because Fort Humboldt has got an outbreak of diphtheria, and I hope I'm saying that name right, but it's a disease. And a lot of people at the fort have caught it, and a lot of people have even died from it, which is why there's such a large amount of soldiers, on this train. And because the whole idea is, they're going to be bringing replacement soldiers, to replace the ones that have either, fallen, to the disease, or are ones that are just too sick. But they're also bringing, vital medical supplies. And so, that's why there's such a hurry. And that's why, Governor Fairchild and his fiancée Marica are, insisting on, going on this ride as well. And that's why they were given clearance to, because, Marica was the daughter of, one of the bigwigs at the fort. And so now that, that's out of the way, everyone settles in and everything. But as the ride goes on, we start to, pick up clues that not everyone on this train is who they appear to be. And more than one person turns up missing, and a couple of people even turn up, stone cold dead. And so it becomes obvious that there is either a killer or multiple killers on the train. And someone wants the train to make it to Fort Humboldt, but not with everyone on board. And it ends up falling to John Deakin to be the unlikely, sleuth to start to unravel this, mystery ball, so to speak. And so, and as a result, we end up going from a murder mystery to a full-blown criminal conspiracy that stems from Fort Humboldt. And, we, go on, with the train off the rails into a rather, violent action climax, and at the by the movie's end. And so, but yeah, that's the basic, setup for Breakheart Pass. It starts off as, a murder mystery, and then, becomes a bit of an action thriller, and by the movie's end, becomes, a bit of a war movie in a roundabout way. So a lot of twists and turns, and by the time it gets to its violent climax, I mean, it's been a pretty wild ride, and it's something that, has kept us engaged. And this was actually, I thought it was pretty cool seeing, someone like Charles Bronson in a movie that was a straight up, for the most part, a straight up murder mystery. And, with his character, the character of John Deakin, being a wanted criminal, it's always fascinating when you have a film wherein the protagonist is a criminal of some sort, and yet it falls to them to be the ones to save the day, or at the very least play a vital part in saving the day. And as I said, no one on this train, okay, very few people on this train are who they appear to be. And that definitely applies to John Deakin. And so there is a twist with his character that I thought was pretty cool, which I won't reveal, but which kind of goes a long way towards explaining why he's so good at, deductive reasoning, and why he he's so good at observing stuff, and so, I do like how, prior to this revelation, we bought you're kind of like, okay, is he like a legitimate criminal who just happens to be, very quick on his feet, or, very good at observing stuff, or is there something more to his character? And so I'll just leave it at that. But Charles Bronson does a really good job, and this comes at a point where, he hadn't settled into, the one man tough guy, movies yet. Like he was still in movies that, had quality stories with quality actors and quality people behind the camera. And so Charles Bronson, of course, brings his A game to the table. And I mean, make no mistake, I mean, he's still a strong silent type of actor, but he was very good at it. And this was yet another film where he got to show off, just why, he was, so widely regarded in that manner. And so as far as, hits go, I mean, Breakheart Pass was definitely a good film to have on his resume. And I do like how, there comes a point where he ends up having a certain measure of control over the situation as the movie goes on. But I like how at first, he's in a very vulnerable place. And, basically, this is someone who ends up becoming the protagonist, or being the protagonist. I mean, Charles Bronson has top billing, so he's going to be a protagonist. But just because he's the protagonist, that doesn't mean that, he's, without weaknesses. I mean, because, much like, us, I mean, he too is trying to figure out, what's going on, with this train, or with the people on this train. And we also, see that, like the way he, interacts with people. I mean, he, like the way he's able to play his character, just kind of, taking notes on people, like in his head. I mean, he's really good at it. And of course, when it comes to the action scenes, he doesn't disappoint, because Charles Bronson, when he was in an action movie, like in this, or whenever he was in a fight scene, I mean, he sold it. And I'm sure they had some stunt people here and there for like long falls and what have you, or for particularly dangerous, action, bits. But when you saw him on screen in an action scene, I mean, you knew you were in for something good as far as, what you saw unfolding on screen. So yeah, Charles Bronson did a great job in this film. And this is definitely, one of his, good ones. But you also had a bunch of other people here. You had, for example, as I mentioned earlier, Ben Johnson playing Marshall Pearce. And, Ben Johnson was one of those actors who could play both good and evil, or something in between. And one of the things he's mainly remembered for is it was his part in the Wild Bunch, which that's a pretty good one to check out as well. Very violent, especially for its time. But yeah, Ben Johnson though, really good, actor. I mean, I hesitate to call him heavy because he didn't just play heavies. He played like people who had some substance to them, and weren't just one note characters. And so I liked how with his character with Marshall Pearce, his character isn't that likable. Like, we buy the fact that he's like a marshal and everything. Like, he has this sort of swagger that can only come from being a veteran of your field. And whether you're a jerk or not, one can't deny that your stuff, that kind of thing. And he has that kind of swagger and that sort of confidence that he brings to the part as the marshal. And so the Marshal Pearce is more than a bit of a jerk at times, but we also don't doubt that he's a figure of authority. But at the same time, though, as the mystery, as film goes on and the mystery unfolds, we're kind of like, okay, is Marshall Pearce just a jerk, or is he a crooked jerk? Like, is he a part of this criminal conspiracy, or is he just someone who has his head up his ass, that kind of thing. And Ben Johnson, played it in such a way to where, you're like, you might be leaning, one way in terms of, is he a jerk, or is he like a part of this conspiracy? And it keeps kind of going, keeps you guessing. But Ben Johnson, because of, how good he was at playing sort of heavies or tough guys, he was a good actor to have for the part of Marshall Pearce. And then of course you had Richard Crenna, Colonel Troutman from the Rambo films. He's an actor that I've really come to appreciate over time. Like, the first time I saw him in anything was in the movie First Blood, the first Rambo movie. Great film, check it out. But he was even good in this horror movie with Peter Weller called Leviathan. Not that good of a movie in my opinion, but Richard Crenna was good in it, but he was a very, very good character actor, and he could play all sorts of roles. I mean, heck, he was even in that movie with William Hurt, called Body Heat, and I forgot the actress' name. Was it Kathleen Turner? But anyway, Body Heat, I mean, that's definitely like a film noir, steamy, erotic type of movie with a bit of crime drama thrown into it. But Richard Crenna, I mean, he was great in that film. Sorry, I'm kind of geeking out here. It's just it's like you talk about familiar faces and you start to remember their big hits, or at least stuff that you remember them in. But Richard Crenna, though, he much like Ben Johnson, I mean, he kind of keeps you guessing too, because one minute he's very genial, very polite with everyone around him, as the governor, or his character, the governor, is very genial, very polite with those around him. But then he'll be very insistent about the train making it to Fort Humboldt on time. And sometimes you're kind of like, okay, is this him being eager to get to Fort Humboldt because his fiance's father's there and might be dying from the diphtheria epidemic, or is he in too much of a hurry to get there? Like, is he tied to a conspiracy too? And so Richard Crenna, like, his character, I thought, was one of the things about the film that kind of keeps you guessing, because he's definitely a figure of authority. I mean, he's literally a governor, but are we like, okay, is this, just a harried governor, or is this a corrupt governor, who's in a hurry for less than reputable reasons, that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, definitely another plus to the film. And then we have Jill Ireland, who would go on to become the wife of Charles Bronson in real life. And from there, she would be in, more than a few films with him, in one way or another. Um, and it was interesting seeing her, on screen here, with Charles Bronson, because, if I remember correctly, I want to say it was at this point in time, they hadn't. I don't think they'd been married yet. They were still kind of like getting, I guess, going, out with each other, getting to know each other, or what have you, because, the way, their characters, play, off of each other, the way Jill Ireland plays Marica, and the way Charles Bronson plays John Deakin, and like when they're interacting with each other, there is a definite chemistry between them, and it's not like, say, romantic chemistry. It's like a developing chemistry, like, her characters, getting to know John Deakin, and John Deakin's getting to know Marica, but at the same time, it kind of feels like, Jill Ireland's getting to know Charles Bronson and vice versa in real life. I mean, so, sort of some reality subtext there, which I found very fascinating. And, initially it was just a feeling, but one of the things they point out on the commentary track of this film is, this was around the time where, Charles Bronson and Jill Ireland, I don't think they'd gotten married yet, but they were starting to, kind of go out with each other. Like they were starting to get to know each other in real life, and so, to have that kind of chemistry kind of show up on screen, and find out that, well, yeah, it's because, of real life plot development, so to speak. I thought that was, rather interesting to find out and rather neat to see show up on screen. Because even though it's not a romantic chemistry, it is a chemistry that you see where, two people, are kind of getting to know each other, and it sort of goes, to further reinforce, the notion that this, criminal, John Deakin, could be the one to, solve the mystery, because we, see certain layers, come undone with his character when he's interacting with Marica. But Jill Ireland, though, I thought she did a pretty good job, playing her part, because, I mean, at first she sort of comes across as a damsel, one who's, being coddled by, her fiance, the governor, and all the other men on the train, because, they're, most of them are, political or military, personnel, and, they take their job seriously, and there's, a woman on a train, and we have to safeguard her, that kind of thing. And so it's like she sort of comes across as a damsel, and you get the idea that she's used to it, or used to being treated like a damsel. But then, when she's interacting with John Deakin, like when she kind of looks in on him to, make sure he's not too uncomfortable in his restraints and what have you, I mean, you get the idea that she's sort of rebelling, against, everyone else, like, her fiance and, the military, personnel that are there. And maybe in some roundabout way, maybe she's sort of, spiritually rebelling against her father, since her father's, head of the military at Fort Humboldt too, So in her interactions with John Deakin, you see her, basically come to life as a person, as opposed to, say, just a damsel who's having to be coddled by all the men around her, or kept under her, husband's protection at all times. But it's funny when she's sort of breaking away, there is that sort of spark of rebellion that sort of, shows up on screen with her character and her character's mannerisms too, because, she becomes like a little more discerning about things, and we see that, certain interactions, result in her starting to take more things into observation, that kind of thing. And so, Jill Ireland, I thought, did a good job playing Marica, and she had good chemistry, with, her soon-to-be husband, Charles Bronson. And so, another actor that I thought did a good job was Ed Lauter, who played Major Claremont. And Ed Lauter is one of those guys who, he's good at playing characters that are flawed individuals, I think. I mean, the main thing I remember him is from the Burt Reynolds film, The Longest Yard, and he was great in that film. I mean, he plays a grade A jerk that, we kind of start to see, it has some nuance to him, and we kind of can sort of put together why he's a jerk, but then, sort of by the film's end, I mean, he becomes someone that is kind of likable, once he goes through some character development. And without saying too much, Major Claremont is, to me, kind of another one of those characters. I mean, and Ed Lauter does a really good job playing him because, I mean, he comes across as very strict, very rigid, and, he's kind of a father to, those under his command. And, so even though, Sergeant, Billow is the one that most of the men see as kind of like, the father figure of them all. Major, Claremont is, the one who is sort of run the show as far as, the military, portion of the train, or the military people on the train. And so when, you have, people turning up that are part of his command, or people turning up murdered who were a part of his command, yeah, I mean, we definitely buy the fact that, I mean, he may be a jerk, but not sure if he's a part of the criminal conspiracy, because, I mean, if he is, he's doing a very good job of, hiding his complicity, because he's good at playing, someone who's, concerned for the safety of his men, or he's, angry at finding out that, certain people have disappeared, or, and so on and so forth. And so, Ed Lauter is another actor that goes a long way towards enhancing, the murder mystery aspect of the film, because, I mean, we're trying to figure out, okay, is this, someone who, is a strict but, legitimate, figure of authority, or is he too complicit in this criminal conspiracy, over at Fort Humboldt? And so, seeing him in that kind of role was, it wasn't exactly a big stretch, considering, his part in The Longest Yard. But when he gets to interact with, character actors like, say, Richard Crenna or Ben Johnson or Charles Bronson, I mean, we get to see how good of an actor Ed Lauter is. And, and so in some instances, I found myself, kind of, and, before finding out, the truth of all this conspiracy stuff in the film, there were moments where I found myself kind of going back and forth between feeling a touch of pity for his character and then being like, okay, you're coming across as a jerk, man. You might want to pump the brakes a bit, that kind of thing. So, he kept me guessing. So once again, we have another, good performance here. And, there are a whole bunch of other people in this film, but last but definitely not least, we have Robert Tessier, who, was really good at playing bad guys, and he was in a lot of movies in the 70s. Like, he too was in The Longest Yard. And he was also in Hard Times. So this isn't the first time that he's, played, a heavy in a Charles Bronson film. But he was also in another Burt Reynolds film called, he was in the movie Hooper. I don't think I talked about him a lot when I did a review of Hooper, but he was in the movie, though. And one of the things they point out in the commentary is that his voice in Breakheart Pass is dubbed. And because you hear him talk in these other movies and it sounds totally different, but they have him sounding deeper. But yeah, Robert Tessier, semi-spoiler, he's kind of the, ringleader of this criminal conspiracy. And he plays a very, cold-blooded individual, Levi Calhoun. And there comes a point when in fact, it's in the scene that introduces his character, we see him execute someone. And this is a PG film, but there is a lot more, blood and gore than I thought there'd be in this one scene, because he shoots this one guy in the head, and it's like, damn. But the way Robert Tessier plays it, though, is just like a very cold, very matter-of-fact way in which he does it, with a certain amount of sadism, because while he's not like mustache twirlingly mad, I mean, he's sort of cold and calm and calculated about the whole thing. Like he puts a gun to the guy's head and then just basically says something along the lines of, well, why do we need you anymore? And just sort of smiles when he says it, and then has the gun to the guy's head and pulls the trigger, and yeah, you see a gruesome head wound as a result. But yeah, just in that scene alone, you're kind of like, okay, this guy's gonna be a problem. So yeah, I mean, as the movie goes on, and we learn more about this conspiracy and everything, and Levi Calhoun's character becomes more prominent, Robert Tessier gets more time to shine as an actor. But I mean, this is definitely one of those films where we see just how good of an actor Robert Tessier was when he got to play a bad guy. We saw why he was kind of pigeonholed into playing bad guys, but he was very good at it, though. Okay, so another thing I thought was pretty cool about the movie was you had a really good score by Jerry Goldsmith. I keep wanting to call him James Goldsmith, but I know it's Jerry. But yeah, Jerry Goldsmith, the guy who gave us, several wonderful scores over the years. I mean, the original Star Trek movie, like the very first one, Alien, Poltergeist, all sorts of other films. And I want to say he worked on L.A. Confidential, but don't quote me on that. But nonetheless, I mean, the guy's done wonderful stuff over the years. And to hear his work on this Charles Bronson Western, it was kind of like, yeah, this is nice. I mean, it's like the fact that you have Charles Bronson in a Western with a bunch of character actors, at a point in time, prior to him being pigeonholed into one-man vigilante films. I mean, you already, get the feeling that you're watching a classy film, okay? But when you hear a Jerry Goldsmith score, in such a film, that just elevates it to where, I mean, it has a touch of class more than it already did. And also, the production design on this film is just wonderful. I mean, granted, the majority of the film takes place on the train, but they did such a good job in, setting things up to where, this really looks like something that you'd probably see in the 1800s. Like if you looked at, photographs of inside of trains from, back in the day, or even like in the scenes where, like at the very beginning when they're at the whistle stop. I mean, that looks like something from the 1800s. So whoever the people in charge of production were, I mean, they did their homework in terms of setting things up and making it look like this movie's taking place in the 1800s. Aside from the fact that it's a color picture, But yeah, so this was like a well put together movie with a wonderful soundtrack and some good actors, and also no small amount of suspense, because as the movie goes on and the mystery, the plot thickens, and the body count rises. I mean, at first it's sort of like subtle in some ways, like a person missing here, a person turning up dead there. But then there comes, a set piece where, let's just say, the main train's separated from the rest of the train. You have the engine car, and maybe one or two of the other cars, have been separated from the rest of the train. So basically sabotage, right? And what we have is a very terrifying sequence where, the people in the cars that have been separated, they realize, where the train's going backwards, we can't stop. And, you have, someone trying to, make it, outside to where they can like manually, pull the brakes or something. But it's just the train's just going too fast. It's going too fast. And then, then we see the train literally go off the rails, and it's like you're seeing, a genuine train, just falling apart, falling to pieces, once it hits the ground. It's like, damn. So I do like how when it comes to the suspense of the film, it sets the mood. Like, it's like a build up, and then something like that happens, like, whoa, and then it kind of goes back to, okay, build up, and then you have, like a memorable action, scene where Charles Bronson, ends up, on top of the train, fighting, one of the killers against a snowy backdrop. I mean, you have some fantastic stunt work there. And it's because it looks like, the way the fight's choreographed and everything, it looks real. And so, I mean, there's stunt work being done at some points, but at the same time, they did such a good job of filming things to where it's like, we've had this build up, and then suddenly, we have this very intense fight to the death, between, Charles Bronson's character and this other guy. But yeah, I that's one of the things I did like about the movie. It's like it had good action scenes, like especially at the climax, when shit really hits the fan and, the conspiracy's, been revealed, and, then it becomes an all-out, war movie almost at the very end. But the thing is, for every action scene there's a good build-up to it. And the build-up, just further enhances the mystery. And at some points, we might put two and two together, but it's only after a certain point where we get the whole picture. So yeah, I mean, this was a pretty good murder mystery that eventually turns into an all-out action movie at the very end. But it waits till the end to do it, though. So it's not like you have action every 5 seconds, and the action you get before the climax of the movie is very well done in the sense that it's more intimate, like namely in that fight to the death on top of the train. But yeah, I mean, like the only thing that I can think of that would keep this movie from being great are, the fact that a couple of the characters I thought, I mean, like, don't get me wrong, like, all the actors in this movie are good, but when you have certain actors that are known for playing certain types of roles, you can kind of, figure out, okay, he's a part of the conspiracy, he's not, that kind of thing. So in that respect, while it was cool to see these actors, do their thing, it was a letdown when, I had a very strong feeling that they were going to be a part of the conspiracy somehow. I just didn't quite know how. And so I'm not saying like they did a bad job, but it was a little bit of a disappointment, when I was able to, call it on, someone being a part of the conspiracy based on the fact that their actors are very well known, or I should say were very well known for playing bad guys. And so in that respect, I mean, some people, like myself, might be able to, solve the mystery, a little faster, than the people who made the movie wanted you to solve it in that respect. And also, as good of a murder mystery, that the movie is, I do think that when it comes to, say, like the criminal conspiracy, like once you find out what's going on, I mean, it's fairly easy to understand what's going on and everything. And I do like how they went out of their way to sort of, make this into a bit of a thriller because, they're using telegraph to communicate. I mean, it's the 1800s after all. But when they get to certain points and the line's dead on the other side, I mean, that just kind of adds to the isolation of it all. And so I did like in that respect, how all these, obstacles are added, just to further, ensure that this criminal conspiracy succeeds, and it adds to, the tension and everything. But I did think that there were a couple of bits where it felt like maybe a simpler explanation or would have been better in some scenes, because they go all out on establishing certain things about certain characters, but then either that revelation turns out to be a lie because the characters aren't who they appear to be, or maybe that information was accurate and all, but in terms of, say, what's going on with the rest of the film, it just adds a little confusion to it all, because it's like you're trying to put two and two together and you're trying to follow it, and for the most part the film is pretty easy to follow. But there are a couple of times where this is kind of a pet peeve I have with a lot of conspiracy movies or mystery movies, is when they try to add too much to it. And so at times I did kind of have to double back and be like, okay, what do they mean by that? Or, okay, so that's going on and instead of that, or that's going on along with that, that kind of thing. So, I mean, it's not too much of a problem, because for the most part, they do a pretty good job of, explaining what's going on, by the time you get to that point. But I think the fact that you can kind of guess what's going on, just based on, how some of the actors are very well known for playing heavies or bad guys, plus the fact that they try to make the mystery a little more complicated than it needs to be. I think those are, the things that sort of keep the movie from, being great. Like it's a good movie, but they kind of hold it down, to being good as opposed to great. But it's still a good movie though. So I'm going to go ahead and, oh wait, one other thing. This isn't a complaint, but it's just a slight word of warning. And I touched on it a little bit when I was talking about Robert Tessier's role in the film. But the violence in this film is a little more graphic than I thought it was going to be. Now, I understand that this is PG and is 1975, and I mean, heck, there are PG films from a certain point in time where it's like it wasn't out of place to hear a certain F-bomb pop up here and there. I mean, if I remember correctly, that Chuck Norris movie, Lone Wolf McQuade, that was PG, and there was a F-bomb at the very beginning. So, but anyway, yeah, no F-bombs here, but the violence, though, it's a lot more graphic than I thought it would be. Like, we're not talking, say, all-out gore fest, entrails everywhere, like, I'm not talking like that bad, but that bit I mentioned where Robert Tessier's character, the head outlaw, executes this one poor guy, and you see the head wound, the resulting head wound. I mean, it's not pretty. Like, it actually looks like, you actually do see, him pull the trigger, and you see a gun go off, and then you see, the back of the other side of his head go off, So that was actually pretty gruesome, and it's brief and everything, but still, it's kind of, damn, because you're thinking like the 70s, this is going to be like a little headshot and, or at the very least a quick cutaway. But no, you actually see that in a PG movie. And then, when it gets to, say, some of the other action scenes, they don't play around. Like, when you see people, fall off the train, I mean, okay, yeah, it's a dummy on some level, that's, hitting, the bottom and everything, but they still do it in such a way to where there's a genuine intensity to it. And like, you see the aftermath, it's not pretty. And then when it gets to like the climax, and like you basically have two armies going at each other, one military army and one outlaw army. You do see some pretty bloody stuff there too, like people getting slashed with sabers and everything. Like one character, one of the main characters ends up getting slashed kind of down the middle, and and that's how they die. So so it's funny because like it's not too gory for my taste, but it's more violent than I thought it would be. And when it comes to say like the blood and stuff, or how the wounds are conveyed. So I mean, good makeup job for sure when it came to say like showing how such wounds would be on someone. But to see stuff like that in a PG movie was something that I was kind of surprised by. So I'm just saying, like, if you're with family and stuff like that, and you're wanting to say, hey, let's watch this Western with Charles Bronson in it, and and then it gets to those violent moments, I mean, it might be like, hey kids, you might want to cover your eyes a little here and there, so that's the only warning I would throw in. So I'm not saying it's a problem, but just be warned that even though this is a PG movie, when the violence does happen, it is brutal. So but yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and give Breakheart pass 4 out of 5 stars. This was a good movie, and definitely something to check out if you're a Charles Bronson fan. And heck, I mean, everyone in this film does a good job here. So if you're a Richard Crenna fan, Jill Ireland fan, or Ed Lauter fan, I mean, definitely something to check out. But as far as bonus features go, you have a pretty good audio commentary track with film historians Howard S. Berger, Steve Mitchell, and Nathaniel Thompson, as well as a theatrical trailer. And the audio commentary is pretty good. And this is a movie that all three of those guys really enjoy, and you get the idea that they love westerns, okay, and they like themselves some Charles Bronson too. But you find out some cool stuff, and also some funny stuff too. And so that bit I mentioned about the train being derailed or being uncoupled and then going off the rails, it's a terrifying scene within the actual movie, okay? And yes, that is an actual train car, or that's actually a couple of genuine train cars being destroyed. And so you listen to the commentary track, though, there is a funny story about it. And so the special effects people, they went out of their way to put, several mannequins in those trains, okay? Like several, life-size mannequins in the trains. And so, when it happens in a movie, like when the trains are going off the rails, you literally hear all the screaming, before the trains hit the ground and just fall apart, okay? In slow motion, I might add. And so, or no, it wasn't quite slow motion, but they did slow it down a little bit, when the trains hit the ground and, more or less just came apart. But the special effects people put some actual mannequins in there to, because it was going to be a pretty high body count. This is going to be a money shot scene, so to speak. But unfortunately, though, the way it's filmed, you don't see any of the mannequins, okay? And so in the commentary track, they were talking about that, and then they were just cracking up because they're like, oh man, those people must have been pissed off, because it's like they spent all that time, getting the mannequins ready, like putting the costumes on, and then and there's this wonderful shot of this train going off the rails and then hitting the ground, and you're hearing all this screaming, but you don't see any bodies. And so listening to that on the commentary track, I just cracked up, And so, I mean, so it is funny because you're watching the scene in question. When you see it in the actual film, it's a terrifying scene. But if you're watching the movie while listening to the commentary track and it gets to that part, I mean, it's hilarious. Like I myself, I was literally just cracking up, But yeah, it's a good commentary track. So yeah, that was Breakheart Pass. It was a good movie. 4 stars out of 5. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen to my review. And if you made it this far, thank you very much for sticking it through. Or thank you very much for sticking through, or sticking to the end. Yeah. Thank you very much for sticking to the end. There we go. Let's go with that. But if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you got any questions, comments, please feel free to drop a line and let me know. And if you haven't seen this movie yet and you're a Charles Bronson fan, check it out. It's one of his good ones. So y'all take care. Have a great night. Bye.